A racist officer arrests a black pilot and takes his private jet unaware that he owns an aviation company. What starts as a biased background check turns into an unexpected expose when the truth comes out. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. What city or country are you watching this video from? Let us know in the comments. James Livingston drove his sleek, silent electric car into the private airport. The familiar hum of the vehicle blending into the soft rustling of the morning breeze. The airport, though small, boasted an air of exclusivity and efficiency. It was the kind of place that only a select few could afford to frequent, and James had worked hard to become one of those people. Today, as he arrived for an important business trip, he couldn't help but feel a swell of pride mixed with anticipation. The polished chrome of his private jet gleamed in the early light, parked strategically on the runway, awaiting its owner. The plane was a reflection of James himself, efficient, modern, and exuding understated luxury. His company logo, a sleek design with bold lines, was elegantly displayed on the fuselage, a symbol of the aviation empire he had meticulously built over the years. This trip was yet another step towards solidifying his company's place in a competitive market. As James exited the car, his polished dress shoes clicked softly on the tarmac, and he took a moment to breathe in the crisp, cool air. He adjusted his tailored navy suit and checked the time on his watch. An elegant timepiece more functional than flashy, but nonetheless a mark of his success. A small group of ground crew members stood near the plane, chatting among themselves, but their attention shifted to James as soon as they noticed him. There was something in their eyes, though, a flicker of suspicion that James couldn't quite ignore. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, like a faint shadow creeping across an otherwise sunny day. Over the years, James had learned to spot those signs, the slight narrowing of eyes, the pause in conversation, the way people sometimes double-checked his credentials. He'd hoped that in a place like this, where professionalism should reign, such doubts would be absent. But clearly, he was mistaken. He nodded politely to the technicians as he walked toward the jet, pulling his briefcase along with him. They nodded back, but their expressions remained stiff, their eyes quickly darting away. He could feel their unease lingering in the air. His thoughts drifted to the meeting he was flying out for, a significant deal that could open up new international markets for his aviation company. His business had taken off in recent years, and he had earned his place at the top through grit, resilience, and strategic foresight. But despite all that, James was no stranger to the challenges that came with his success. The higher he climbed, the more apparent it became that his success made some people uncomfortable, and it had little to do with his business acumen. As he approached the jet, James made a quick mental check of the flight plan, running through the details of the route. Flying was not just a mode of transportation for him, it was a passion, something he had pursued long before starting his business. He had earned his pilot's license after years of dedication and training, and now flying his own plane had become a personal form of freedom, a way to remind himself of how far he'd come. Before climbing aboard, he paused, glancing back at the small airport terminal. The building itself was simple yet functional, glass windows reflecting the brightening sky, a clean, modern facade, and only a handful of passengers passing through at this early hour. Yet there was something about the atmosphere that felt off. It wasn't the airport itself, but the people inside, a few employees standing near the entrance, watching him with a certain level of intensity that went beyond casual curiosity. James sighed, trying to shake off the unease. He'd faced prejudice all his life, and unfortunately, his success had only heightened the scrutiny. But he wasn't about to let that stop him, not today, not ever. He turned his attention back to the task at hand. The technicians were now preparing the jet, making final checks on the engine and the fuel levels. One of the ground crew members, a stocky man with a furrowed brow, approached him hesitantly. "Excuse me, sir," the man began, his tone neutral but laced with something James couldn't quite place. "Are you the pilot for this aircraft?" James raised an eyebrow, slightly taken aback by the question. He had provided all necessary documentation when booking the flight, and everything was in order. There shouldn't have been any confusion about who he was or why he was there. "Yes, I am," James replied, keeping his voice calm and measured. I'm the owner and pilot. The man blinked, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face before he quickly masked it. I see. Well, we just need to double-check some things before you take off. Standard procedure. James nodded, though he knew this wasn't standard. He had been through this process many times before, and the steps they were taking now were far from routine. But he also knew better than to argue just yet. Instead, he handed over his pilot's license and all necessary documents. The man took the papers, glancing over them quickly before heading back toward the control tower. James watched him go, his unease growing. This wasn't the first time someone had questioned his legitimacy, but it was always frustrating to see how fast assumptions were made, especially here in a place where his accomplishments should have spoken for themselves. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the tension for a moment. It was a reminder for his meeting, one that now felt farther away than it should have. He dismissed the notification and turned back to the jet, deciding to continue with his pre-flight routine. There was no use dwelling on what he couldn't control. As he inspected the exterior of the plane, checking the windows, wings, tires, and engine, the whispers from the ground crew grew louder. He could feel their eyes on him, and the tension in the air was almost palpable. But he focused on the task at hand, refusing to let their doubts affect him. He had dealt with this kind of behavior before. It didn't matter how successful he became, how many planes he owned, or how much money he made. There were always going to be people who doubted him, who saw him as an outsider, as someone who didn't belong in their world. But James had learned a long time ago that the best way to deal with that was to keep moving forward, to keep proving them wrong by succeeding in ways they never expected. The technicians finished their checks, giving him a brief nod of approval, and James climbed into the cockpit, feeling the familiar rush of excitement. Flying had always been a way for him to clear his mind, to leave behind the stresses and prejudices of the world below. As he settled into the pilot seat, he ran through the checklist in his mind: fuel levels, engine status, weather conditions. Everything seemed in order. But just as he was about to start the engines, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. Two airport security officers were standing by the edge of the runway, watching him intently. Their postures were rigid, and one of them was already speaking into a radio. James frowned. This wasn't normal. Something was definitely wrong. And then, almost as if on cue, he saw the flashing lights of a police car pulling up to the runway. James closed his eyes for a brief moment, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He had a bad feeling about this. The whirling lights of the approaching patrol cars cut through the morning haze, painting the tarmac with red and blue flashes. James watched the scene unfold with a mounting sense of dread. He stayed seated in the cockpit for a few moments longer, gathering his thoughts. There was no question in his mind what this was about. He'd seen this play out far too many times. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt, took a deep breath, and climbed out of the plane. As his polished shoes hit the tarmac, the officers stepped out of their vehicles, hands resting dangerously close to their holsters. "Sir, please step away from the aircraft," one of the officers barked, his voice sharp with suspicion. He was a stocky man with a buzz cut, wearing mirrored sunglasses that reflected the bright morning sky and the sleek outline of James's plane. James raised his hands slightly to show he was no threat, maintaining a calm demeanor. "Good morning, officers. I'm James Livingston, the owner of this aircraft and the pilot. Is there a problem?" The officer squinted at him, ignoring the polite introduction. "We got a call about some suspicious activity," he said curtly. "Can I see some identification?" James kept his expression neutral as he reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. He handed over his pilot's license, aviation certifications, and the plane's registration papers. The second officer, a younger man with an eager look, snatched the documents and began flipping through them without much care. "This your plane?" the first officer asked, his tone heavy with disbelief. "Yes," James replied evenly, suppressing the frustration building inside him. "I've owned it for 3 years. My company operates several aircraft like this one." The younger officer sneered. "Must be nice," he muttered under his breath, clearly skeptical that someone like James could afford such a luxury. James bit his tongue. He knew better than to escalate the situation, no matter how insulting the officer's behavior was. He'd been in similar situations before, assumptions made, questions raised, and every success of his life questioned the moment people looked at his skin instead of his achievements. The officers exchanged glances, and the older one gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was clear they weren't convinced. "Look, sir," the older officer said, his voice taking on an edge of warning. "We need to make sure these documents are legitimate. There's been a lot of fraud going around. We can't take any chances." James exhaled slowly. "I understand," he said, though it took effort to keep his voice measured. "But I assure you, everything is in order." The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. He motioned toward the jet. "Step away from the aircraft while we sort this out." James took a step back, watching as the younger officer continued to thumb through his documents with a smirk that suggested he'd already made up his mind. His hands were visibly shaking, not from nerves but from the growing anger he kept locked inside. Every instinct told him that these officers weren't interested in finding the truth. They were looking for an excuse. Meanwhile, several airport staff gathered near the edge of the runway, whispering among themselves. James could see them pointing in his direction, adding fuel to the fire. Their expressions varied from curiosity to outright suspicion, and none of them seemed inclined to intervene or clarify that James was indeed the rightful owner of the jet. "Where are you headed, Mr. Livingston?" the younger officer asked, the skepticism in his voice barely disguised. "New York," James replied patiently. "I have a business meeting." The older officer nodded slowly, as if filing that information away for later. "Why didn't you hire a pilot?" James smiled tightly, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "I am the pilot." The officers exchanged another glance, this one loaded with doubt. The younger one laughed under his breath, a short, derisive sound that made James's hands curl into fists at his sides. "Let me get this straight," the older officer said, crossing his arms. "You're telling me you're the owner and the pilot of this aircraft? And you just show up? What, by yourself? No flight crew? No assistant?" "That's correct," James confirmed. "This isn't my first flight." The officer stared at him for a long moment, as if waiting for him to trip up or reveal some inconsistency. When James remained calm and collected, the officer finally spoke into his radio. "Control, we're going to need a full ID check and verification on a private aircraft," he said, his eyes never leaving James. James felt the knot in his stomach tighten. He knew what was coming. A full ID check wasn't just a background search. It was an interrogation, and it could delay his flight for hours, possibly even days. "You're not going anywhere until we've confirmed everything," the younger officer added smugly. "We have to make sure this isn't stolen property." James opened his mouth to respond, but then thought better of it. He knew arguing would only escalate things. Instead, he folded his arms across his chest and waited, watching the officers with the same cool detachment they were giving him. "Mind if we take a look inside the plane?" the older officer asked casually, though it was clear the request was more of a command than a question. "Yes, I do mind," James replied firmly. "This is private property, and I'd prefer you not search it without a warrant." The officer's jaw tightened, and James could see the flash of annoyance in his eyes. "If you've got nothing to hide, what's the problem?" James met his gaze head-on. "The problem is that I've shown you my credentials, and I've done everything by the book. If you still don't believe me, that's your issue, not mine." The officers stood in tense silence for a moment, the air between them heavy with unspoken hostility. Then the older officer smirked, as if accepting James's silent challenge. "All right," he said, stepping back slightly. "But don't leave town just yet. We'll be back once we run your name." James nodded, though inside his frustration was reaching a boiling point. He watched as the officers retreated to their patrol cars, radioing in his information and chatting with airport staff. The younger officer cast one last sneering glance in James's direction before slamming the car door shut. For a brief moment, James allowed himself to close his eyes and take a deep breath. He needed to stay focused, stay calm. Losing his temper now would only play into their hands. He pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number.